She reminded you of something you couldn't name. Not love, no. It was older than that. Like the scent of rain on stone before you were born. Like the eyes of a doll you forgot in childhood still staring. You didn't fall for her face. You fell for the silence between her words. The shiver that passed through her when no one else noticed. She carried something cracked and gleaming, and you called it mystery. But it was a wound, and you knew it because it matched the shape of your own. You mistook the tremble in her hands for tenderness, the distance in her eyes for depth. You thought you were the one watching her, but she was the mirror, and you were looking into a memory dressed as a woman. You thought she needed saving, but you were the one drowning in the image. You forgot every time you tried to touch her. It was never her skin you were reaching for, it was something beneath your own. And still, you keep returning. Not to her, but to the shadow she lets you see. She did not seduce you with her lips, nor did her laughter enchant your logic. It was her silence that opened you, a silence you recognized not as absence, but as invitation. And the moment she turned her head not toward you, but slightly away, something ancient stirred in you, like a bell rung behind thick cathedral walls. It wasn't beauty, it wasn't charm, it was familiarity, the kind that terrifies because it does not arrive from the outside. You weren't drawn to her, you were summoned. You didn't fall in love, you collapsed into resonance. You thought it was chemistry, timing, or fate. But no, it was a trap you built for yourself. A trap made of archetypes of the mother you never wept for, the girl you never touched, the self you never became. Her voice only triggered what already lived in you, the ache, the hunger, the unwept sorrow of being unseen. You mistook her for the answer. She was only the echo. You saw her eyes and didn't see her. You saw the reflection of the boy still waiting to be chosen. You heard her sadness and believed it was yours to carry. But you were not lifting her wounds, you were avoiding your own. You called it empathy. You called it depth. But what you truly wanted was redemption. Not hers. Yours. To save her was to save the part of yourself you buried before you knew its name. You think she was broken, fragile, beautiful in her ruin. But her ruin was a mirror, not a mask. And when she trembled in your arms, it wasn't because she was weak, it was because your shadow was finally close enough to breathe again. She didn't need healing, she needed distance, because what you offered wasn't love, it was projection disguised as devotion. And still, you stared. You stared at her scars like they were maps. But you weren't trying to understand her pain. You were looking for an entry point, a way to crawl back into your own suffering without calling it yours. You made her story sacred. You made her pain poetry. And in doing so, you turned her into a myth. One you could worship, kneel to, cradle, and never confront. It wasn't her you loved. It was the theater of your own unfinished grief. You didn't know how to love someone whole. Only broken things made sense to you. Wholeness terrified you. Joy felt foreign. Calm made you suspicious. So when she cried, you felt alive. When she vanished, you felt worthy of chasing. When she crumbled, you felt like a man. Because in her collapse, you found purpose. In her silence, you heard the call to rescue. You needed her to stay fractured so that you could keep pretending you were strong. But she wasn't performing for you. She never asked to be your canvas. You painted her anyway in strokes of longing and unmet needs. You placed your childhood in her arms, hoping she'd cradle it better than the past ever did. But she didn't hold it. She dropped it, not out of cruelty, but because it was never hers. And when she walked away, you felt betrayed, but she did not betray you. She returned what was never meant for her hands. You never wanted her, not really. You wanted to feel needed. You wanted to matter in a place that echoed with the cries of your own abandonment. You made her the shrine, but the god you were worshipping was a wound in your own chest, and the moment she stopped mirroring it, You lost your devotion. You loved her as long as she reflected your darkness in delicate ways. But when she grew tired of being your projection, when she wanted to be real, you turned cold. Because reality is not seductive. It is not tragic. It is not cinematic. And you, for all your claimed depth, never learned how to love a woman who didn't bleed in your favorite patterns. You craved her sorrow like wine. You licked her sadness off her skin like honey. But when she asked to be seen without the costume, when she stopped playing the part of your healing fantasy, you recoiled. You called her distant. You called her confusing. You said she changed, but she didn't change. She just stopped being your mirror. And in that moment, you realized you were never looking at her, only through her. She was the window, not the view. She was the wound that reminded you of your own, and once it stopped aching in familiar rhythms, you felt abandoned, not by her, but by the illusion. You wanted her to open, but only in ways you could control. You listened, but only for cues to step in as savior. You held space, but only so you could feel essential. You gave her your time, but not your truth. Because your truth was this, you needed her to remain hurt, so you could keep playing whole. But the truth hurts more than the wound itself. The truth is this: you weren't rescuing anyone. You were avoiding the reckoning. The reckoning of meeting your own shadow, the unloved boy, the manipulative lover, the man addicted to suffering disguised as care. You were not gentle. You were strategic. You were not loving. You were escaping. She didn't need you. She needed freedom. And freedom meant she had to drop the role of being your reflection, the sacred wound, the mystery, the mirror. And once the mirror cracked, you saw yourself not as the hero, but as the child still crying inside a grown man's mouth. You thought her wound was the entry point. It wasn't. It was the warning, the red cloth at the edge of your inner minefield, and you stepped into it anyway, not to understand her, but to bury yourself, because her pain gave you a reason to avoid your own. And now, you're here alone, but not with her absence, alone with the truth. She was never the dream. She was the dream's messenger, and now she is gone. And what remains is not heartbreak. It is not loss. It is exposure. The light is finally on, and the room is filled with every shadow you projected onto her skin. You did not lose her. You were never meant to keep her, because she was only ever the reflection, and now the mirror is gone, and all that's left to face is you. She never spoke in riddles. You were the one who needed them, because plainness bored you, honesty frightened you, and clarity left nothing for your fantasies to feed upon. You wanted symbols, and she bled them. Every gesture she made, every hesitation, every glance, every whispered, "I don't know," you turned into prophecy. She yawned, and you called it spiritual fatigue. She laughed, and you said it was a mask. She disappeared for a week, and you made it myth. She became the heroine in a narrative you couldn't survive without, not because it was true, but because it made you feel chosen. You didn't listen to her voice. You listened to the orchestra inside you playing over her words, and when she said, "I'm tired," you translated it into "heal me." When she said, "I'm not sure," you heard "convince me." You turned her confusion into poetry, her detachment into mystery, and her contradictions into some secret language only your soul could decipher. But it was never her soul speaking. It was your shadow writing scripts in the dark. You needed her to mean something, anything, because you couldn't bear to face how meaningless you felt without her reflection. She didn't become sacred because she was divine. She became sacred because you crowned her with your hunger. You placed her in the temple of your unprocessed longing. Every time she withdrew, it wasn't cruelty, it was chaos trying to self-soothe. But you painted it as ritual, as the goddess retreating to her cave, awaiting your light. You refused to see her as human, because a human would disappoint you. A human cannot fill a myth. A human cannot hold your archetypes without collapsing beneath their weight. And when she collapsed, when her humanity began to bleed through the veil, you said she failed you. But she didn't fail. She cracked under the pressure of your projections, and you called it betrayal. You made her the mother, the priestess, the anima, the orphan, because those were the parts of you left frozen in the caves of your past. You didn't want her. You wanted the completion of a ritual you didn't even know you'd started. She became the altar, and you offered your childhood upon her skin. Not gently, no. You disguised dependency as love. You disguised avoidance as depth. Every time she spoke of her past, you leaned in not to hear her, but to find yourself in her story. And when you didn't find yourself, you grew restless. You only held space for her pain as long as it mirrored your own. And when it didn't, when she began to express wounds foreign to you, you turned cold, confused. You didn't know how to hold what you couldn't recognize, because it was never about her pain. It was about your reflection in her pain. And when it vanished, so did your attention. You thought you were empathic. You were only addicted to resonance. You thought you were attuned. You were only scanning for familiar wounds. You thought you were giving her meaning. But meaning cannot be given. It is lived. It is suffered through. And she was not asking to be interpreted. She was asking to be seen. But you, in all your myth-making, made her invisible beneath the weight of your symbols. She wore a red dress once, and you whispered to yourself that it was a cry for bloodline healing. She lit a candle, and you said she was invoking the forgotten feminine. She cried in your arms, and you told yourself she was dissolving into your protection. But it was always you doing the scripting. She was just breathing, breaking, rebuilding. You were narrating from a distance you called intimacy. But it wasn't closeness, it was possession. You called her your twin flame, your lost queen, your cosmic partner. But that language was a veil you pulled over her face so you wouldn't have to see the terror in her eyes when you demanded meaning from her pain. You didn't fall in love. You fell into identification. You needed her to carry the archetype that made your story make sense. But she wasn't an archetype. She was flesh. And you didn't know how to love that. Because flesh is messy. Flesh bleeds in ways that ruin metaphors. Flesh asks for soup, not salvation. Flesh gets tired and doesn't always explain. But you know, you needed everything to mean something. You needed every silence to be an omen, every absence a sacred trial. You could not accept that sometimes a woman walks away, not because she's afraid of intimacy, but because she's exhausted by being turned into someone else's myth. And even now, as you sit with her absence, you are tempted to make her ghost a symbol. You say she was the last test. You say she was the mirror sent by the unconscious. You say she triggered your initiation, but perhaps, just perhaps she wasn't a symbol at all. Perhaps she was just a woman who got tired of being read like a dream journal. Perhaps she didn't need decoding. Perhaps she needed someone who would stop building temples with her tears. You never asked her what she needed. You only asked what her patterns meant to you. You never loved her for her unpredictability. You feared it. You pathologized it. You explained it away using diagrams of the psyche and tales of soul contracts. But chaos does not need a container. It needs respect. You tried to control the storm by calling it sacred. But storms do not care for your vocabulary. They break what they must. You once said she was a message, but messages end. And now the silence you're left with is not hers. It is yours. It is the silence of a man who spent too long naming things and not enough time knowing them. A man who built altars in his mind while the real woman was sitting across from him waiting to be seen without being sanctified. Now you replay it all. The way she looked at you when you stopped listening. The way her smile changed once she realized you weren't with her only with your mythology. The way she began to vanish before she ever left. You still see her symbols everywhere, but they no longer comfort you. because now you know they were never hers, they were yours, and you painted them on her like ritual paint, hoping she would dance the story you never dared to write for yourself. You called it divine union, but what you really wanted was a sacred distraction from your unexamined ruin. She bled symbols, but she never asked for meaning. That was your offering, your need, your illusion. And now, the altar is empty, and the candle has burned out. And still you wait for her to speak through signs. But maybe this is the final lesson: not every wound is a portal. Not every woman is a mirror, and not every loss is meant to become poetry. Some are just meant to end. You thought love was rescue. You thought you were the one with the torch, descending into the underworld to lift her from her darkness. You saw her sorrow and called it a prison. You believed she was trapped, and you imagined yourself as key. But she was never calling for release. She was guarding something older than pain, something you could not name. And so you called it broken. You mistook her descent for drowning and her silence for surrender. But she was not drowning. She was holding vigil, not for a man, but for herself. She did not need saving. She was the threshold, and you, so eager to save, never paused at the gate. You barged in with your light, thinking it would cleanse, thinking it would warm. But light, uninvited, becomes interrogation, and in the dark, your torch did not soothe, it exposed, not her you, your need, your obsession, your fear of feminine unknowns. She saw it, the urgency in you, the rush to fix, the hunger to matter. She knew then you didn't come for her. You came to avoid yourself. You wrapped your concern in sacred language. You called her pain your calling. You turned her silence into a sermon. You said the universe brought you to her, but the only universe you were obeying was the one inside you, still orbiting the wound of not being enough. You thought she would complete you, but gates do not complete. They open, and what they open to is not a woman, not a myth, but the part of you that was locked away the moment you learned that love must be earned. She asked for space, and you called it disconnection. She asked for time, and you heard rejection. But it wasn't rejection. It was the ritual of return, not to you, but to herself. You couldn't bear that. You, who built her up as meaning incarnate, as the reward for your inner work. You told yourself, if I love deeply enough, she'll open. But she wasn't a door. She was the guardian of the labyrinth, and you had not yet earned your descent. You tried to kiss the wound before you knew its shape. You tried to soothe her pain before you listened to its language. You rushed toward her suffering, not out of care, but out of desperation to escape your own. You disguised that desperation as love, and she let you, for a time, because even gates will allow entry if the soul seems sincere. But once inside, you didn't sit, you didn't kneel. You rearranged her shadows like furniture. You changed the drapes. You lit candles without asking. You told her, gently, what she should let go of. She watched you, quietly, and beneath that quiet, a storm began. Not because she hated you, but because she recognized the danger of being loved by someone who cannot sit with their own darkness. You praised her vulnerability, but flinched when it came too close. You celebrated her truth, but only when it matched yours. You offered her presence, but it was conditional, cloaked in unconscious expectation. You wanted her healing to be beautiful, predictable, gratifying. You wanted her transformation to unfold in ways that made you feel like the architect. But she was not yours to build. She was the place where your unclaimed self waited. The place where your mother's absence still whispered. The place where your abandoned masculinity trembled like a boy holding a sword he was never taught to use. She saw that. She saw the part of you that came not to witness, but to prove. And when she did not open the way you imagined, when her pain didn't respond to your touch like a key in a lock, you began to withdraw. You called it confusion. You said you didn't understand her anymore. But what you really didn't understand was yourself, the self that can only exist when he's needed. The self that cannot sit in love without a problem to solve. The self that needs her to be broken so he can be whole. She stopped being the gate, and you turned her into the enemy, because you didn't know what to do with a woman who no longer made you feel useful. You thought she betrayed you by pulling away, but the betrayal was your own. You betrayed your depth by making her pain your purpose. You betrayed your strength by needing her weakness. You betrayed love by turning it into performance. And when she saw that, when she felt your hunger pressed into every word, every silence, every embrace, she stepped back, not to punish you, but to protect what was still sacred in her. Because she had seen this before, men who adored her ruins, but disappeared when she began to rebuild, men who praised her for being a mirror, but recoiled when she asked to be seen, men who worshipped her darkness, but feared its fire. She had been the gate for too many, and few ever truly entered. Fewer still made it past the first echo of their own forgotten self. You stood at the edge and thought you had arrived, but you never crossed. You stayed at the threshold, offering flowers and poetry and theories. You never bled, you never broke, you never sat in the silence without reaching for meaning. She felt that, and she closed the gate. You didn't lose her. You lost the illusion that you were ready for what she held. You lost the story that you could save her without facing your own descent. And now, you sit outside the labyrinth, still holding the torch, asking what went wrong. You think she was testing you. She wasn't. She was showing you the place you still refuse to go. You call her complicated. You say she pushed you away. But the truth is simpler. She stopped being your gate because you refused to pass through. You clung to her pain like a lifeline. You knelt before her sorrow like it was a shrine. But shrines are meant to be left behind. You worshipped her instead of walking into the dark temple within. That was the final betrayal, not hers, yours. The betrayal of your own journey. You made her the path and the destination, but she was only the invitation. And you said no. You said it with your comfort. You said it with your need. You said it with every word meant to soothe instead of transform. She was the gate. And now the gate is gone, and the dark calls with no name, no form, no symbol, only the echo of your own unlived life. Will you enter it now without her, without the myth, without the illusion of rescue? The gate remains, but not in her eyes. It lives now where you least want to look, in the part of you that no longer needs to be a savior, only to be true. She was never the ending. She was never the prize. She was the veil thin, flickering between your myth and your mirror. And when she vanished, you thought the story was over, but it was just beginning. Now, there is no symbol to hold, no face to worship, no wound to rescue, only silence wide as a cathedral, cold as truth. You stand at the threshold still, but the door is inside you. You knock, but no one answers. The one who must open it is the one you've never dared to meet. And as the echoes fade, a question remains not spoken, not written, not understood. What will you do when there's no more woman to carry your pain for you? There is no reply, only the sound of your own breath, returning like a stranger to a house you forgot you built.